Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Friday, the 7th of June in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels, where far-right parties are in focus in the European elections as voters across the 27 member nations have their say.
Markets struggle to decipher when the next ECB rate cut may come after a landmark reduction from the central bank.
And we have a special report on Russia's wartime central banker who's increasingly telling Putin things he doesn't want to hear.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Voters are going to the polls in the European Union in an election that will shape the policy direction of the bloc for the next 5 years. The EU is facing key challenges on defence, competing economically with the US, China and other emerging markets, and advancing on its climate goals. Polls taken before voting started suggest far-right parties may boost their numbers in the European Parliament. Head of political risk at consultants JS Held, Livia Paggi, says the results could also impact the EU's policy on Ukraine.
There's a number of trade-offs. There's a lot of parties that do not want to make the political trade-offs in supporting Ukraine, and this is going to have a key impact on the trajectory of this conflict.
As Livia Paggi hinted at there have been calls to ramp up spending on Europe's military infrastructure in response to Russia's war in Ukraine. Much of that funding would have to be approved by the European Parliament. Voting continues until Sunday, with the first projections of the Chamber's makeup expected on Sunday evening.
Now, the European Central Bank delivered on its promise to cut interest rates yesterday. The ECB delivered a quarter-point reduction in the deposit rate from its 9-month peak of 4%. However, investors were left querying where policy is headed next after the central bank president, Christine Lagarde, refused to be drawn on timing.
Are we today moving into a dialing back phase? I wouldn't volunteer that. Because, as I said, we are making a decision on the basis of the confidence that we have that we are on a path.
Christine Lagarde speaking there. While investors are still betting that the ECB will lower interest rates again this year, the timing of that reduction is once again being questioned. Traders went from betting on 2 additional moves this year to favouring just 1.
UK tech mogul Mike Lynch has been acquitted of fraud by a court in San Francisco in a significant loss for US prosecutors. Lynch was accused of duping Hewlett Packard into buying his software startup Autonomy for $11 billion in 2011. Stephen Chamberlain, Autonomy's former vice president for finance, who was also on trial and was acquitted by the jury. Lynch was extradited from the UK last year to face trial in the US after he lost a civil trial in London 2 years ago over allegations that he'd inflated his company's value ahead of the sale.
UK local authorities are warning of a significant funding gap ahead of the general election. According to representatives, budgets are reaching their limits after years of government underfunding. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
While the Labour and Conservative parties battle for victory on July 4th, a council spending crisis could be brewing in the background. The Local Government Association is warning of a £6.2 billion hole in regional budget plans after years of growing demand and government neglect. Costs have soared by £15 billion since the last fiscal year, thanks to double-digit inflation, say the group. These latest administrative woes add to the public service dilemma facing the country's next leader. Think tank The Institute for Government claims some offerings, like adult social care, are on the brink of collapse. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Labour will unveil a scheme to penalise foreign property buyers in the UK as part of its new housing policy. The party plans to raise stamp duty on selling homes to international buyers and force new developments to put domestic offers first. Its policies are being closely watched given its massive lead in the polls. Nationwide data shows a typical UK house now costs 5.2 times average gross annual earnings, up from 4.4 times when the Conservatives took power in 2010.
Keith Gill, whose Roaring Kitty online moniker has sent GameStop soaring, says that he'll be back on YouTube today for the first time in 3 years.
His expected return is sparking further speculation that Gill is bullish on GameStop. Earlier this week, Gill, who became an icon for cooped-up retail traders at the height of the pandemic, shared a screenshot that appeared to show his owning a $116 million position in GameStop. A position that large would make Gill one of the company's 5 biggest investors. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, in a moment, we're going to bring you a story about Russia, why the relationship between Elvira Nabiullina and Vladimir Putin, central bank governor and president, is so crucial to Russia's war economy. But before we get to that, Stephen, you're in Brussels this morning. Had a hugely important moment for the European Union. Of course, it's the EU elections. You know, they take a number of days, but what's at stake?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the midst of voting. So the Netherlands voted yesterday. We have Ireland and the Czech Republic voting today, and the other EU member states will vote over the weekend. This is an election. If you think back, Caroline, to 5 years ago, it was climate issues that dominated the run-up to this Europe-wide ballot. We were in the midst of the climate strikes led by Greta Thunberg. It was an issue that was really central to how voters were thinking about what is an international issue at an international election. This time around, it's the war in Ukraine. It's the defence challenges facing the European Union. Its ambitions to try and ramp up its military infrastructure, ramp up investment in this key and important sector. It is the Green Deal, the ambitious climate deal that was passed during the last Parliament. It is the question of the future of that. How many of those ambitious climate policies can be maintained now? Will a change in makeup of the European Parliament mean some pulling back on some of those goals that aim to make the EU carbon neutral by 2050? Then there's the question too of competitiveness. It's a long-running question when it comes to the European Union, but has come more acutely into focus as we've seen the United States ramping up its spending in the Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, China also supporting its economy there as well. These are big challenges and big issues that need to be tackled by coordination across the 27 member states, and the European Parliament is central to that. Yeah, absolutely. Sort of having to hold its own between the US, China and others. Just talk us through, though, how it plays out. I mentioned that it's 4 days, it's 27 countries. It is a huge mammoth undertaking. Yeah, I mean, 370 million eligible voters across the European Union. It's the second biggest election in this big year of elections after the Indian election we talked about last week as well. This is a question where you'll have the countries voting until Sunday evening. On Sunday evening, we will get the first projections for what the new parliament will look like, how the makeup of those groups will be. Then what happens is you'll actually have some parties at a national level deciding to change allegiance within the European Parliament. So there's a couple of big ones we'll be watching, notably in Germany, the AfD were expelled from the identity group that they're part of currently. So there'll be a question of where they go after this election. And other parties are continuing moves as well. So that's going to be the next step. And then we get towards the subsequent parts to that, which is how you try and build a majority to vote a new president of the European Commission. The national leaders have to decide who they want to put forward as president of the European Commission. We know Ursula von der Leyen wants a second term. If they then decide on a candidate that goes to the European Parliament, that candidate has to win a majority of votes, 361 MEPs there. OK, so let's see whether that happens or not. In terms of the challenges, though, that you've laid out quite neatly about Europe, is that really what sort of voters care about? Because I suppose you're talking quite top level about, issues around trade and competitiveness. But I suppose ordinary voters might have other issues as well that they're worried about. Well, exactly. There are two ways you have to think about these elections. One, there are some people that, of course, will go to the polls with big European issues in mind, but it's also an election being held in 27 different countries. So there are national issues that play into these votes as well. In France, for example, the campaign has been framed as a referendum on Emmanuel Macron's performance as president, and that's going to be seen as a key test of how he's faring at a national level. This is something that we're seeing in other countries as well, where it's sort of serving as a midterm referendum on governments there. When you look at the polling around this, the top issue for voters, poverty and social exclusion, public health, not areas that necessarily you'll directly see some of the big talk about these policies around. Economy and the jobs and defence and security do come up there as well. But voters are mostly going to be concerned with things that affect them directly. It's why we talk about them as being second-order elections, and why, in fact, the results sometimes do involve some people registering a protest vote, which is why we see bigger representations of the far-right groups, for example, in the European Parliament than in national parliaments.
OK, Stephen, good stuff. That is throughout the morning. Let's turn our attention, though, also, of course, to something that does deeply affect and concern Europe. This, of course, is Russia. Elvira Nabiullina has been Vladimir Putin's central bank governor since he made his first move against Ukraine in 2014 by annexing Crimea. She's done as much as anyone to sanction-proof Russia, but the fallout of Putin's full-scale invasion of 2022 has tested her toolkit to the limit. She's faced criticism at home, but Putin still values her, and it's this relationship that may come to define the economy that emerges from war. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg editor Paul Abelski. In terms of how Elvira Nabiullina came to play such a critical role on Vladimir Putin's economic team, just take us through how that happened.
I think she's proven to be a very savvy crisis manager, and Putin, at the end of the day, values results. Some of the people we've spoken with told us that after the invasion of Ukraine, there was a joke going around among officials, which went along the lines of, two surprises awaited Putin. One was just how incompetent his army was, despite knowing in advance what was about to happen, and just how skilled his economists proved to be, despite being the last to know about the invasion. So this kind of, summarizes basically what the technocrats have been able to accomplish, and she is very much part of that group.
Paul, what's been her policy response to the economic and financial fallout from the invasion of Ukraine?
I think we can group it in, we can separate it into groups. Initially, the challenge was just to avoid financial meltdown and panic. And, she did that in a fairly orthodox way. Interest rates were raised sharply, capital controls were imposed. But, as the war economy got going, new challenges have emerged. So now we're talking about record labor shortages, inflation that's been above target and is unlikely to end this year at the central bank's target level. So she is kind of, after the initial emergency response, it's been back to business as usual for the central bank. However, it increasingly seems to be an ill fit for an economy that has other priorities than inflation, and so we're going to be seeing that tension play out increasingly as especially if the war drags on. We're now into the third year, so a lot will depend on just the duration of the conflict.
Yeah, and on that, what is the state of Russia's war economy then? If you say that things are going to become more difficult, how much is the war affecting Russia's economy?
It's warped the economy to an extent that was really hard to foresee. Obviously, the sanctions have disrupted trade, and Russia has been finding workarounds that have largely enabled it to keep energy exports going. And so on. However, we're looking at defense spending that is only been that can only be compared to what the Soviet Union was implementing, and investing capital in tanks and missiles is not the best way to put your money to work. So over time, I think we will see Russia increasingly lag behind, grow more dependent on China and some of its other, increasingly more important trade partners. And in the short term, labor shortages have become extreme. Unemployment is basically is at a record low level. The economy is at full employment. So we're in a situation where it's bumping against sort of some natural limits of what kind of growth and what kind of production can generate. It's not clear where we'll find additional sources of growth and labor.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.